Welcome to Lost in the Supermarket. Our food supply is in the headlines just about every day. As prices soar, shortages increase, and a war almost 6,000 miles away has the head of the UN food program predicting that it'll get even worse. U.S. farmers are working hard to establish a safe and secure food supply domestically while climate change is creating new challenges each and every day. One of our core crops comes from the hard work of our U.S. soy farmers. So I invited Mac Marshall from the United Soybean Board to give us the lowdown. Mac serves as the Vice President Marketing Intelligence for the USB and the U.S. Soybean Export Council. His background includes serving as a staff economist at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics with a focus on agriculture commodities. Mac serves as an industry source of market information and analysis here and globally. I can think of no one better to give us the real take about what's going on. Mac, welcome to Lost in the Supermarket.
Thank you very much for having me, Phil.
So before we get to the current situation for soy, share with me your view globally of what's going on. At the supermarket, we're seeing the highest prices in 40 years. And folks like David Beasley from the UN are saying it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Your thoughts?
Well, first off, I'm glad that we're opening this up, I think in a broad fashion and really looking globally. Certainly I represent the U.S. soy industry, but we are just one part of the global complex of providing food security globally. You mentioned inflation, and I'd be remiss if I didn't point out last week we had new inflation numbers come out showing annualized inflation across the board of 8.5%. A lot of that being driven, of course, in both the food and the energy space. Now, in the U.S., I'm born in the U.S., I've lived here my whole life. I think it's really important for us to, count our blessings in that at a global level, we don't spend a ton of money on food relative to our total consumption. We're under 10%, but the rest of the world is not in that same place. There's a lot of food insecurity globally that exists in any time and environment, but I think it's becoming really acute right now. Certainly the disruption, the war, the human tragedy, the cost that is happening in Ukraine is incredibly relevant for the global food supply. Ukraine is a major producer and exporter of, particularly small grains, say corn, wheat, barley, but also a major producer of sunflower oil. Actually exports about half the world's supply of sunflower oil. And if you look internationally, you look at the markets that Ukraine sells into, a lot of them are very price sensitive and very reliant on imported grains and veg oils for, their domestic food supplies. So, where we are right now is of course very challenging. In food insecure nations that have a lot of price sensitivity, anytime you have a shortage, it is the impact of it becomes that much more paramount. And I think it's important to know too that even just with the disruption over the last 8 weeks roughly with the war in Ukraine, we had been in, or the world rather, had been in a situation, at least on the veg oil side, that has been bubbling up for a couple of years. If we think globally about the major vegetable oils, be it soybean oil, be it palm oil, be it sunflower oil, rapeseed/canola oil, one way or another, in the major centers of production globally, there's been disruptions across all of these. If you look in the Black Sea, even a couple of years ago, predating where we are now, there are short crops in in sunflower seed production in both Ukraine and Russia. Last year, we had a drought across, southern Canada in the prairies where canola production is centered. This year in South America, facing a second consecutive year of La Nina, we've seen, over 30 million tons of projected soybean production come off of the books. And then in Southeast Asia, with palm oil, we're in an older part of the tree cycle. It's a 25-year crop, basically production cycle there. And with trees being older and in a less productive phase of, their whole evolution, overlaid with some of the labor issues that have cropped up by virtue of, palm oil plantations not being able to bring in foreign labor due to COVID restrictions, all of this has kind of, put the world in a position where vegetable oil supplies and production relative to total utilization, it's gotten very, very tight. And this is, of course, before we've had the disruptions in the Black Sea over the last 2 months. So, I'm trained in time series analysis. I'm trained to, look at, the history, of food price evolution, of commodity market development over time. And when I'm analyzing something in the here and now, I tend to look back at historical analogs. And I think the position that we're in right now, when you stack up the political disruptions that are out there, when you stack up the supply chain disruptions, when you stack up some of the production shortfalls, it's very hard not to look back to 11 years ago in 2011 when FAO food price indices were at their then highest. We've of course eclipsed those now. That came out a couple of days ago. I think March had the highest reading of all time in terms of food price costs on a global level. And you look back to that period in 2011, I feel like we're very much in an environment right now. Now, of course, when we think about annual production cycles, how it's split between different corners of production globally, the U.S. Soy farmer, I think collectively is coming back in at a really important time. Combines are starting to roll around the country. We're going to see, potentially a, record area sown for soybeans in the U.S. And it's really important because that's the first step in helping bring back critical supply to a global level here, particularly when the world really needs it.
So you're painting a picture that really says to me that for most crops, we're going to have some issues, not only because of the war, but climate change, getting truck parts, and so on. Specifically for U.S. soy, where are we? Are we going to have shortages? Are we going to have the farmers out there working hard? Are we going to have an abundant supply? Where do you think we're going to look at when you look towards the future?
Well, I think for the future, the future is bright. I mean, I think it's very, very easy, again, when you're in the world of commodity market analysis, to have some degree of recency bias and be focused on the here and now. But I think as we look ahead, as we look, several years down the line, we've got continued innovation happening on, the input side. Farmers in the U.S. have been able to, continue to produce more and more and do so in an efficient way. Last year actually produced a record soybean crop, not even on record area or anything. And this is against the backdrop of a lot of drought conditions that prevailed through much of the summer. So I think that really underscored the resilience of U.S. production. And it's that resilience that's going to be critical in the years to come. So this year, USDA announced that we'd be planting potentially 91 million acres of soybeans, surpassing, just over 90 million acres, which is the record in 2017. You assume trend yields upon that, and that's a crop size of about 4.6 billion bushels or 125 million metric tons. That would be a record for us, and I think it really is important, but it doesn't make up for a lot of the production losses that have already happened this year. I think rebounding from that is going to take a couple seasons to get through if you really focus on a global level. But that I think is the beauty of continued innovation of hardworking farmers and a globally integrated food supply chain, which has certainly come under pressure over the last couple of years, through COVID, as well as just a lot of disruptions in logistical corridors. But it's these periods of disruption when the world, I think, is really feeling these pain points that also lead to creative solutions to help get out of it and set a better stage for the future. Now, that's not to discount, I think the difficulties that are unfolding right now in terms of, global supply security and availability. But I'd like to think that the troubles that are unfolding right now can also be catalytic in creating efficiencies going forward that allow for, greater levels of food security. But we, of course, have to get through where we are now. But the first stage of that is getting that crop in the ground, and that's what our farmers are starting to do.
Explain to me biofuel and the role between soybean oil and biofuel and what's going on there.
No, it's a great question, and I think incredibly relevant and timely. So to give a little bit more history around biofuels and how they interrelate with the soy complex. So if we go back to the 90s, and actually let me do a little bit of stage setting even before that. So when you crush soybeans, if you were to crush, say, 100 pounds of soybeans, you get roughly 79 pounds of meal and about 19 pounds of oil there. So basically, roughly a 4-to-1 volume split between what comes out on the protein side, which primarily goes into animal ag. So that's, on a volumetric basis, that's primarily flowing into food production. And then the oil side is, primarily utilization channel is, of course, food. But, back in the 90s, oil was kind of this, underappreciated, commodity, and the emphasis was always on meal. So, we were looking for additional utilization channels, and partially through checkoff-funded initiatives. We had the establishment of a biodiesel program here in the United States. Now, in the years since then, and particularly in the last couple, there has been a concerted new push for next generation biofuels, and in particular renewable diesel, which is different from traditional biodiesel. It is something that is chemically equivalent to diesel, and leverages a lot of the feedstocks that we have here in the U.S. Or lipid-based feedstocks. Soybean oil is, of course, on a volume basis the most important one that flows in, but there are other feedstocks as well that allow for production of greener fuels, and this can be collection of waste greases, of distillers corn oil, yellow grease, poultry fat, et cetera. All these, can be refined and effectively turned into renewable diesel. But again, on a volume basis, soybean oil is the most important component there, which I think, and I'll just address the elephant in the room right now. It raises the specter, I think, of, where are we allocating this feed stuff? Are we putting it in food? Are we putting it in fuel? And I would say that's part of the versatility and beauty of the soybean, is that we can effectively service these two markets simultaneously. And what I mean by that is, when you're crushing beans, we've always crushed for protein, we've always crushed for lipids or fats here. And as we're seeing this wave of demand, a greater appreciation for the versatility and value of soybean oil in the marketplace. It's leading to additional crush expansion within the United States, which will, over the next couple of years, be adding to our overall production of both soybean oil and soybean meal. More soybean meal, of course, means, greater availability to flow into animal ag production, and, I think further enhance and stabilize, domestic and overseas production of animal proteins. Whereas on the oil side, yes, we're seeing growing demand in the biofuel space, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at the expense of what is flowing into the food space. And just to give you a data point on that, so in the U.S. last year, or in the 2021 crop, which was a record, we produced just over 120 million metric tons of soybeans. And the volume of soybean oil ultimately produced from those soybeans that, flows into, food utilization channels is about 6.5 million tons. By comparison, into the biofuels channel, it's under 5 million tons. So less than 4% of soybean production actually does eventually wind up in the biofuel space. So I think it's a well-balanced utilization of the commodity. And, yes, we're talking about the impact of global food supplies and availability of, critical feedstuffs. And certainly, vegetable oils are, an important part of that. But it's not that food security is the only issue that we have to address here domestically and internationally on a truly global basis now and in the years to come. We have major existential crises that are happening globally. It's not just food security, but it's also energy transition. How do we think about mitigating climate change? How do we think about, meeting some of those climate reduction targets? How do we combat global warming? And energy transition is a critical piece of that. And by the way, if we think about energy supply, if we think about the need for diversification of it, a move towards more renewables, energy plays a role in every element of life. It plays a role in food delivery. It plays a role in food production. So I think by, having this advancement in the biofuel space and soybean oil playing a role as a critical input there, it's also effectively helping on the food side too. It's just through indirect and maybe unforeseen angles too. And again, I want to come back to just on a volumetric basis, we talk about ourselves as an oil seed, but we're also fundamentally a protein seed. 80% go into that meal and and protein space, which goes into animal ag. So it's complicated. There's a lot of nuances to it, but part of the reason that I get excited to work for the soybean industry is that we have a role in addressing some of these really critical, human and global challenges, both on the food and the energy side, and how that all comes together to, stabilize an environment domestically and globally.
If you could look into your crystal ball and see what the future holds for soy. So you mentioned, it's single digits being in biofuel. If it increased, if it doubled in biofuel, what would that effect be? Now with safflower oil and sunflower oil being at risk, are we going to see more soybean oils replacing that? Look in your crystal ball and give me your little forecast here.
No, it's a great question. Let's get back to some of I think the market signals and developments that are unfolding right now and will be unfolding over the next few years. So I mentioned earlier, I think a greater appreciation for, the value and versatility of soybean oil, which is part of the reason why you're seeing, this, growing demand in the renewable diesel space for soybean oil as a feedstock, among other feedstocks. It's one element that plays a role in helping supply that downstream market. What that is effectively doing is enabling this new wave of private sector investment across much of the U.S. into new crushing facilities, which will allow for greater production of soybean oil and soybean meal. So again, just to throw out a couple numbers here, we crush about a half of the U.S. soybean crop. So again, we produced about 120 million tons last year, crushed about 60 million of it. And, just based off of company announcements in terms of new plants that are coming online or being expanded over the next couple of years, we're probably seeing, over a 20% increase in crush capacity, between now and the end of 2025. So what that means is, the roughly, 12 million tons of soybean oil that we, currently produce now, we could be adding, a couple million tons on top of that. Now, some of that will, of course, flow into, this new or emerging sector of demand in the renewable space. Certainly, more soybean oil being drawn in there as a feedstock. But it also means that availability for the food channel, is going to, remain there. Part of what I do in my role in market intelligence is look down the line, look, 5, 10, 15 years down the line, and what does the future environment look like? And as we look out towards, the utilization opportunities and where soybean oil, soybean meal, whole soy complex fits in meeting, the aggregate demand picture as well as, competing potentially sectors of demand. I think what's exciting is that, we can provide, more soybean oil, assuming, of course, that these plants are coming to fruition, which all market, indicators seem to project, that as we grow that supply and availability and ability to produce more soybean oil in the U.S., we can have it flow into that biofuel space while still, maintaining and even growing, at least to some degree, the use of soybean oil in food applications. I mean, that's absolutely critical. So I think it's a little bit of more of a balancing in terms of where we're utilizing soy and soy products going forward. And that's part of what our purview is as the soy checkoff. How do we think about a balanced portfolio, domestically and internationally, between food uses, between, novel industrial uses, again, because there's so many challenges out there that we're facing in the U.S. and beyond. And, part of our vision, I've got a vision statement actually over here that's out of the camera angle. But our vision here is to, promote soy for every life, every day. And every life, every day means addressing, the critical needs of humanity, the hierarchy of needs. Everybody needs food, clothing, and shelter. And, certainly soy through animal protein, through, direct human consumption. We certainly have, food grade channels as well. And of course, oil flowing in is a major ingredient in many, in many food applications. All of that together, that's certainly addressing the food piece. But I'd say, through, shelter and those other, and clothing as well, that whole hierarchy of human needs, like we're able to address that, I think, by playing a role in both the food and the energy space as we work towards, an overall green transition. I think that's very exciting as a whole.
Well, Mac, you are the right guy. Thank you for your intelligence and your insight, and thank you for joining us today on Lost in the Supermarket.
This was an absolute pleasure, Phil. Thank you so much for having me.